Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Norman Finkelstein. Professor Finkelstein is a leading scholar on Israel-Palestine conflict, and his well-known books includes Gaza: An Inquest into Martyrdom and Holocaust Industry. Professor Finkelstein, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I wanted to discuss the US Israeli war on Iran with you, and maybe a good thing to do is to hear your thoughts about what's going on, and then I have a few questions to follow up.
Well, let me begin with the caveats. Number one, I am very far from an expert on Iran. Number two, I have no military knowledge whatsoever. So if you're going to ask me about Iranian history, you're barking up the wrong tree. And if you're going to ask me who's going to win, uh, you're not going to get an informed answer. You're going to get a wish list, not an informed answer. Um, as to the situation now, first of all, was predictable. And I said it. I wrote in an article about probably a year ago now. It was something Cassandra and Samson and Cassandra. Samson and Cassandra. And I said what was perfectly predictable at the time, namely that Israel viewed October 7th, yes, as a crisis for sure. And there was probably a moment's lamentation over what happened, but then they rubbed their palms of their hands in glee. Here was a historic opportunity such that, first of all, it had no real precedent except for the 1948 war. I wouldn't even say the magnitude of October 7th was a precedent on the order of June 67, because Israel did have problems in June 67. It had to pretend in June 67 at the beginning that Egypt fired the first shot. If you listen to Abba Eben's speech on June 7th, 1967, they were still claiming that Egypt fired the first shot in this June 67 war. Secondly, um, the UN wasn't a passive instrument of Israel in 1967. And there were the head of the UN at the time, the Secretary General, Utant, very decent guy, very decent guy. Uh, he was not in Israel's pocket. And he wasn't in the, first of all, the US and Israel hadn't yet solidified their relationship. So the US wasn't yet in Israel's pocket. So there were real problems for Israel in 67. 48, it looked like, the armies were going to destroy Israel and the so-called invading Arab armies. So they had an easier time, a bigger, let's call it a bigger historic opportunity. But this October 7th opened up vistas for Israel. All of its desideratum, I think that's the word, all of its the goals, its aspirations were now on the table. They were a viable possibility. And so there was solving the Gaza question, the uh, annihilation of Gaza, solving the West Bank question that's still on the agenda. And if the war really heats up, and if Israel, quote unquote, faces an existential threat, they will use that new opportunity to expel the entire population from the West Bank. There was the possibility of, which was realized, of defanging Hezbollah. And then there was the big Megillah, which I wrote about, the Samson and Cassandra article, that they would go after Iran, because that's obviously been on their drawing board for a very long time. And the opportunity now availed itself, and Israel took advantage of that opportunity. So that was not a surprise that Israel would. Well, what was interesting from my point of view was, as you know, under in human rights law, let's call it, or in the human rights community, um, the crime of crimes is genocide. That's what it's called. And as Robert Jackson said, the US prosecutor at Nuremberg, he described aggression as the supreme international crime. It was a wonder to behold. I would say if there were, say, an extraterrestrial being were to alight on our planet, it would be for that being a sight to behold that Israel and its chief enabler, the United States, committed the crime of crimes in Gaza, and not even a blink of an eye, not even the blink of an eye, separated execution of the crime of crimes from what Robert Jackson called the supreme crime of aggression that Israel and the US undertook. February 29th or 28th? Well, it had to be 28 because there are only 28 days in February. February 28th. So the sheer, I wish I could call it brazenness. I wish I could call it audacity. But if you listen to the Security Council, a large number of states went along with it. I was just, my jaw dropped. My jaw dropped when I'm listening to the representative of Denmark, which already had a taste of Trump, and not one word, not a syllable, not a character criticizing, forget condemning, criticizing the US or Israel for launching a brazen war of aggression against Iran, the most outrageous, the most outrageous breach of the UN Charter. France lines up 100% with the US and Israel in the Security Council meeting. UK in the Security Council meeting, the president of the council, there's a distinction between the president of the Security Council and Guterres, who's the Secretary General. The president of the Security Council is a Brit, is the Brit representative to the UK. He wouldn't even allow Jeffrey Sachs to speak, because usually they allow representatives of civil society. And the Russians this time were very forthright, saying that the British are rigging the Security Council. No shame. No shame. So you can't even say what the US did was brazen, because brazen implies that the act elicits outrage. But the aggression didn't elicit outrage. You know which the aggression, it elicited outrage at Iran for daring to defend itself. It elicited outrage at Iran. I agreed with the Russian. Look, I'm no great fan of Putin. I'm not a great fan of Russia. I recognize its repressiveness and its brutishness. But the Russian, he said, it's like the E3, the UK, Britain, and Germany. He said it's like they live in a parallel universe. He said it was like through the looking glass. Do you understand what just happened? The most brazen, outrageous, flagrant breach of Article 2 of the um, UN Charter. And they're blaming Iran? They're blaming Iran? What did Iran do? It's like nobody has even read the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 4 says, of course, it says, every country has the right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. What was Iran doing in violation of that? Where's the evidence that Iran violated Article 4? You know who's violated the NPT for a half century? Do you know who has violated for a half century?
Israel.
The US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. Because there was a quid pro quo in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The quid pro quo was that the signatories who were non-nuclear powers would give up their right to develop nuclear weapons in exchange for peaceful development. But there was another article, Article 6. Article 6 says that the nuclear powers have to engage in serious negotiations to eliminate their nuclear weapons. It never said that those who have nuclear weapons have a right to keep them. That's not what the NPT said. It was to be the complete elimination of nuclear weapons for a very simple reason, which is stated in the preamble to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The preamble says that the use of nuclear weapons can cause untold devastation, the end of humankind. So if that's their potential, of course you have to get rid of them. That's what the NPT, it never said you get to keep them. Everyone's saying, we have to make sure Iran can never have nuclear weapons. Really? First of all, folks, who just committed the genocide in Gaza? Was it Iran? Or was it Israel? Second, why do we have to make sure? We have to make sure that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. But we don't have to make sure that Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons. But why is that? Why is that? That psychotic, lunatic regime, state, society, the whole place is completely bonkers. So I have to say that I don't understand. I'm listening to this Danish representative. Are you crazy? Do you not see what just happened? The degree of sheer moral cowardice. You know the famous line by Mark Twain. After God invented sheep, human beings were a redundancy. Yeah. Redundant after he created sheep. Pitiful. Pitiful.
Yeah, on the E3, I think it was not surprising given a couple of months before that they invoked the snapback saying that we are imposing sanctions because again stating Iran is violating the terms on the JCPOA while Iran was negotiating, and as it was last time, as Al Busaidi, the minister of Oman, foreign minister of Oman, said that Iran was very close to even accepting terms and conditions that went further than JCPOA. In June, they were bombed, and still,
And what was wrong with the JCPOA? It was working fine.
absolutely.
It was Trump that arbitrarily suspended it, and then Biden, he refused to renew it. There was no problem with the JC. Nobody was saying that, nobody said that Iran wasn't abiding by it. For the sake of your listeners, the Joint Comprehensive plan of action, and it was negotiated under Obama's administration, and nobody complained about it, except, of course, Israel, because Israel doesn't want any regional power that has a nuclear deterrent against it, because it wants to dominate the region.
Yeah. But this time around, I think the issue was not even about the nuclear issue, as the conflict forums, based on their reading of Hebrew press around December, they said that the Hebrew press was reporting that Netanyahu, in the meeting in Mar-a-Lago, said to Trump that the moot issue now is not about the nuclear issue. We know that Iran is not going to have
Yeah,
that. It is about breaking up Iran.
the issue was the opportunity to rid itself exactly what it did in '67 when it rid itself of Egypt. And uh, June '67 marked the terminal defeat of what was called back then radical Arab nationalism. And now they want to inflict a terminal defeat on what's called radical Islamic fundamentalism. So it was not the nuclear issue. I mean, Iran would have to be, as you can imagine, would have to be um, uh, insane to attack Israel with nuclear weapons. So that's not going to happen. It was simply to not allow finish or to do what Iran what it did to Egypt in 1967. Now it's true in '67 they weren't trying to disintegrate uh, disintegrate Egypt. Now they don't really much care. It's like when I hear people say, "Well, look at all our policy failures, the disintegration of Libya." Does the U.S. care that Libya is disintegrated? Do they care? That's not a policy failure. It's just a matter of indifference to the U.S. Um, yeah, the question of Iraq is more, I would say, more complicated. The disintegration of Iraq is more complicated than the one in Libya, and so would probably Iran. But it was the opportunity. It was the opportunity to finally rid itself of Iran and then have no obstacles to its total regional control. I'm beginning not to like the word hegemony anymore. Total regional domination or control.
I want to ask you a little bit about the domestic mood, given some of the polls suggest that the war is extremely unpopular, maybe even to three-fourths of the population. And this was striking. I mean, in one sense, this was not surprising, given it came off after the genocide, which had shifted public opinion massively. And so not surprising that this is probably first American war that is unpopular from the get-go. But given its unpopularity and given how the ruling elites in both Europe and the US, in Australia, they have doubled down on it. What is your assessment of how that divide between the elites and the people at large is going to pan out?
Well, I think there are a lot of there are some I won't say a lot. There's a lot of some misapprehension about the popularity of the war as compared to previous wars and things of that sort. So if we go back to 2003, uh, on the build-up to the U.S. attack on Iraq in 2003, those at that era there were the largest anti-war. You're too young to remember, I suppose. They were the largest anti-war demonstrations in the history of the world, opposing the U.S. attacking Iraq. So if there's any notion floating that that was a popular war, that was not a popular war at all. And you will recall that unlike 1991, where the US secured 8 consecutive Security Council resolutions, including that critical last one, which basically, but not literally, but basically allowed Israel to attack what was called the First Gulf War. In 2003, Bush had a very hard time at the UN. He couldn't get any UN resolution supporting an attack on Iraq. Germany, under Helmut Schmidt and the foreign minister, I didn't particularly like him, but he was like a leftist, they called him, a leftist who occupied. He was in the Greens, Joschka Fischer, uh, opposed openly the attack on Iraq in 2003. My memory is so did the French, but I don't want to be, my memory may be imperfect there, but I think
Yeah,
the French also
the French were opposing.
oppose it. So it was not a popular war domestically. The largest anti-war demonstrations in U.S. history and global history. And there was a large amount of opposition from European countries. So this notion that this is, as it were, an unprecedentedly unpopular war is simply incorrect. There may have been a
Can
plurality.
I can I have a brief comment
What?
here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think my sense is that yes, 2003 we had massive demonstrations, but this time around we haven't had that kind of demonstration. But I think some of the polls, I don't remember them exactly, back into about 2003, what it said was that first there was the question of occupation, which meant that gradually, as the resistance became firmer and firmer, public opinion gradually shifted. But this time around, what we are seeing is, on one hand, we haven't seen the kind of demonstration that was there in 2003. On the other hand, the polls show that there is a huge uh, negative opinion about the war, which means that probably because of the brazenness with which the US is clamping down on domestic freedom and so on, so that might be one of the reasons. So the other reason might be people don't care that they can influence their governments in the West. I mean, there might be cynicism, but I do think that there is that divide we are seeing this time, that in the public poll we are seeing that it is highly unpopular, probably even more
That's
unpopular than
correct.
2000. But the demonstrations, the activists
Yes,
are not as active as it used to be in 2003.
yeah, I think that's correct. I think Americans are tired of war. That I'm sure, but I think there is a notion about 2003 that's mistaken. And the left in 2003, its position was, and you can go back, I mean, I've studied it and I also lived through it. I was active at the time. Um, the position was it's going to be an easy war, but an impossible occupation. And that proved to be exactly correct. The left was very good in predicting what would happen in Iraq. As you know, Obama famously opposed the war. Well, that's a kind of a BS. Like everything Obama is, it's complete, it's total BS. Obama, first of all, the senior senator from Illinois at the time, Dick Durbin, he opposed the war. He opposed the attack. Secondly, Obama came from a liberal district, which was Hyde Park, and they opposed it. Third of all, his biggest fundraisers, Penny Pritzker, her brother now is, I think it's her brother, is now the mayor of Chicago. Uh, she was one of his big money bags. It wasn't Pritzker, it was somebody else, and I forgot her name. They were opposed to it. So they took no courage at all. And actually, David Axelrod, who was his campaign manager, said you should come out against it. He thought politically it would help him to come out against the attack. So uh, it was a popular position to be against it. It didn't take any particular political courage to oppose it. Second of all, it all depends what happens. If the US wins in another week, all of the opposition will vanish. Trump will be gloating. Everybody else will be hiding. So where public opinion ends up will depend on how this thing unfolds. So I wouldn't attach too much importance to public opinion opposing it until and unless we see how public opinion reacts if it turns out that the US and Israel successfully decapitate Iran. There is another comparison which I believe is important with 2003, and that's this whole issue of the tail wagging the dog. Who is in charge here? Now, in 2003, it was very different, very different. And I don't think people, in my opinion, fully understand the difference between 2003 and today. Dick Cheney, the vice president, and Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense. They were very smart guys. They were very competent guys. They were very hardworking guys. They had long experience in government. Each of them, their experience, believe it or not, stretched back 50 years. They were like Clinton. Clinton was already active, and he was in the Senate, working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in his 20s. When you are into politics, it's almost always the case. You start very young, in the 20s. They got it in their bones, in their blood, and in their bones. So you had two hyper competent people at the senior level, namely Secretary of Defense and Vice President. And then you had staffing all the bureaucracies, very hyper competent neoconservatives, people like Douglas Feith. Okay, I don't like them. I think they certainly deserve to be hung from the highest lamppost, maybe from the Eiffel Tower. But one can't doubt their sheer intellectual competence and their conscientiousness. They work hard. Okay? So that's where I disagreed with now my friend, John Mearsheimer. I strongly disagreed with the book, on the lobby,
Israel lobby.
The Israel lobby book. It was called The U.S. and the Israel Lobby. It had a very neutral sounding title. I can't remember now. I strongly disagreed with it because the premise of it I found completely absurd. The premise was that Israel managed to dupe the US ruling elites into a war which was not in the US national interest. Well, as I said in my critique of them, nobody dupes Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Now, they were wrong about being able to win the war, for sure. They had a very specific notion of our national interest, which was not necessarily shared by all the ruling elites. That's for sure. There were members of the ruling elites who opposed the war. Okay, so that I agree. They were smart, but not as smart as they thought they were. And they thought they were acting in the US national interest, but others calculating the US national interest reached entirely different conclusions about the wisdom, the prudence of going to war with Iraq. But duped, tricked, no. Nobody tricks or dupes Dick Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld. Doesn't happen. Now we're in a very different situation. Very different. The person currently occupying the Oval Office is an ape. He's an ape. He looks like an ape. He talks like an ape. His syntactical structures, to use a phrase from Professor Chomsky's magnum opus, his syntactical structures are of an ape. He is not the missing link. No, that would be an insult to the missing link. He's an ape. There's no evidence that he reads anything. Whenever he's awake, he devotes his entire waking hours to just Truth Social or watching Fox News. I very much doubt, every morning the president has on his desk the briefing book from the major intelligence agencies about what's going on. I very much doubt he reads it. The only thing Obama did when he wasn't watching basketball was he was reading he did every morning. He read the intelligence briefings, no question about that. He was like a good fourth grader, a studious fourth grader, People like Clinton, no, Clinton was perusing the presidential library, always digging up stuff. He was very intellectually curious, for sure. Obama read the briefings. Trump, nothing. Nothing. Trump it won't come as any surprise to you listeners. Trump is a stupendous megalomaniac. He carries himself, the ape in the overcoat, like he's a cross between Caesar and Napoleon. No, you're not Caesar. You're not Napoleon. You're an ape. Who has he surrounded himself with? Well, there's Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio, when he goes to the toilet, he brings along his GPS to find his anal cavity. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Hegseth. He must spend half of his day under a blow dryer. This is the Secretary of War. Are there any people knowledgeable who are actually advising him? If you look at the female candidate, the females occupying high office, they all look like they just came out of Hooters. I've never seen a sight like this. The people he's chosen around him. And even if they had a scratch of intelligence, a jot, even if they had a jot of intelligence, would they dare criticize the great leader? I mean, do you listen to the guy, the UN rep? Oh, I forgot Witkoff. I forgot Witkoff.
Kushner.
And Kushner. Kushner, I think he should lay off the puberty blockers and grow some facial hair. His face looks like porcelain. It does. He's overdoing it with the puberty blockers. And then Witkoff. Okay, if I needed somebody I don't know anything about golf, so if I were on a golf course and I need to know whether to use an iron or a wood, I would ask Witkoff. Nuclear negotiations? So I think it is quite possible in this particular case that along comes Mr. Netanyahu. He says Iran is on the precipice. It's going to just, a little terror bombing, a few strategic assassinations, and the whole place will crack. And Trump Trump is a good used car salesman. He could convince Trump because the kinds of Looney Tune cartoons that Netanyahu used to hold up at the UN. You would know what Looney Tunes are. It was an old cartoon series. Yeah, that's sort of those sorts of illustrations. They probably would work with apes like Trump. They probably would work with him. So there is a possibility here that when Trump made his decision born of megalomania and ignorance, he wasn't calculating any US national interest. I think that's possible. I mean, you have to remember what should be obvious, that at the end of the day, even national interest is mediated by human beings. It doesn't just snap into place. It's not like you have AI. What is the US national interest on March 8th, 2026? You don't have that. It's all mediated by human beings. And that guy operates the White House, occupies the Oval Office. And it's quite, first of all, he doesn't care, except for the fact that he thinks he is the national interest. We had an expression in the late 1950s was, what's good for General Motors is good for the country. It was assumed that what's good for the corporations is good for the US. In this case, Trump is more along the lines of Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi, I am the state. So to that extent, you could say, look, Trump comes from the billionaire class, so he's going to express the billionaire interest. That's true. But then there's all these idiosyncratic, eccentric sides to Trump. And there's the stupendous megalomania and the fact that he's not surrounded by anybody with any degree of even marginal competence, and the fact that they treat him like Kim Il-sung, the great leader. As I said, if you watched the UN rep for the US, President Trump said yesterday, President Trump said, does anybody care what President Trump says about anything? He's an ape, you know? So in my opinion, it is different than in 2003 in the sense that it is plausible that Israel played a deciding role in what unfolded, because Netanyahu being a good used car salesman and holding up diagrams that are fitted to Trump's mental capacities, he may have persuaded him. So here I'm willing to say that whereas I was most skeptical of 2003, this notion that Israel managed to lure in Israel managed to lure the US into waging a war that wasn't in its interest. I would say even that struck me as most implausible. I would say this time, yeah, I think Israel could have played a decisive role in what happened.
Yeah, this is very convincing given in 2003, the US had a much bigger, grandiose aim. They went into Afghanistan. It was also a moment of unipolar moment where the US had much bigger aims, and the amount of resources that they poured into the region was way, way higher than what they were typically giving to.
The US was very clear. The goal was it was going to be Iraq, Syria, Iran. There was a difference of opinion between the US and Israel at the time. Israel wanted to go after Iran first, and the US wanted to go after Iraq first, but they all had in mind Iraq, Syria, Iran. Obviously, it didn't work out that way because Iraq uh, didn't happen. It didn't unfold in Iran as they had hoped. So I think that difference to me does stand out. So the usual quote unquote leftist position that it's the US that's the door that's wagging the tail. Here, I think, you know what? Israel does play a bigger role. than I would normally have ascribed to it. I would have been curious if Professor Chomsky were uh, uh, among us, whether he would have been as dogmatic in his position that this was a U.S. No, in terms of enabling the attack, of course it's U.S. I mean, Israel couldn't blink an eye without U.S. military backing. So as the enabler, yes, of course, it's the U.S. But as the the architect, uh, I think it's probably closer to Israel. It's as I say, in the case of Trump, it's a combination of the stupendous megalomania, and there were two sets of circumstances. The many, uh, there were the many successes he enjoyed from the UN granting him the deed to Gaza, to then Venezuela. He didn't, so it looked like it might be another easy victory for him. But then you have to remember he also there was a negative side to his balance sheet. Greenland did not go as he expected. Minnesota turned into a disaster. He had to withdraw. And then there was the US Supreme Court decision on the tariffs. So it was a combination of two sets of circumstances. The many victories he chalked up, and he thought it would be the same or he had been convinced by Netanyahu, it would be a walkover in Iran. But there was also, he needed to divert attention from the succession of defeats, the Greenland debacle, the Minnesota debacle,
China
the U.S.
debacle.
Supreme Court, China.
Yeah, he said he could win the tariff war. He lost.
Right. The tariff debacle. And then I don't know where it's going to rank in the history books, the Christie Noam debacle. So he needed something to change the subject, a nice victory to change the subject. So when you combine those two, yes, he had a significant incentive to attack Iran. But of course, he had to know the variables, the unknowns, the dangers that lurked. And there, he had no domestic advisors. None. None. And it's quite possible. The U.S. under Cheney and Rumsfeld, they would never defer to Israeli intelligence. They knew Israeli intelligence works for Israel, and they're going to provide information that's good for Israel. They're not going to defer to U.S. intelligence. It's not going to happen.
Just for our viewers, I wanted to plug in, excuse me, the US National Intelligence Council, which compiled reports from 18 different intelligence councils, had published a report saying that any kind of attack, including that of a decapitating strike on the supreme leader, would not lead to quote unquote regime change.
I'm sure he never
totally
read
ignored
it.
it.
Yeah, ignored it. He never read
Or
it.
never read it, yeah.
He's incapable. I mean, just remember, Trump is 78. And he wasn't the brightest light in the circuit, the sharpest tool in the shed when he was 28. I don't believe he reads anything. Reading, believe it or not, I know this will come as a shock to many of your reviewers, but reading takes time. And it takes mental energy. And he has the mental energy and the discipline of reading a tweet. That's it.
And in 2000,
I know why people would be shocked at me saying that. Cheney and Rumsfeld, they work so hard. I had a friend, he's now deceased. He was the head of the computer system in the White House, a brilliant guy. He was a chief technology officer for Unisys, UNISYS, which is the largest defense establishment computer company in the world for the US. It's in Washington. And he was a childhood friend, brilliant guy, no question. And he once said to me, he knew we were on opposite sides in this whole thing called US power. And he once said to me, Norm, I want you to know, because he was in the White House every day. He was in charge of the computer system. I want you to know, they work very hard, meaning Cheney, Rumsfeld, the whole bunch of them. And I'm thinking to myself, of course they work very hard. They're defending their interests. The system of which they're the beneficiaries and of which they're deeply committed to. They're defending their interests. So of course they work very hard. Trump worked very hard. No. Hegseth, yeah, he works very hard combing his hair. I'll give him that. Rubio, no. So there was a void there. There was a mental void in the most literal sense. There was a vacuum. And the Israelis filled it. They filled it. So I do think that in this case, it's fair to say it was in large part an Israeli war. Though, of course, we have to make distinctions in terms of the architecture. But in terms of enabling it, Israel couldn't do anything, were it not for the United States. Like the idiotic thing that Rubio said, we had to go in because Israel said it was going to attack. Oh, really? Trump could have just turned, it's all BS, but even if it were, let's just say a hypothetical, he just turns to them and says, okay, you do what you like. You're a sovereign country, but you're not getting any US weapons. We're not going to protect you at the United Nations. We are going to support Iran in the UN. It's over. It's over.
2003, they were also the intelligence was at least correct on the unpopularity of Saddam Hussein. Of course, they cooked up things about weapons of mass destruction, their links with Al Qaeda, and the whole democracy business. All of those things were completely misunderstood or they cooked up. But at least the intelligence was correct that the entry of the U.S. troops would be easy given the unpopularity of Saddam Hussein. But this time they were completely wrong.
Everybody expected that. That was a assumption on the left that the U.S. would easily defeat Iraq on the battlefield. The question was the occupation, which they said was going to be protracted in a disaster. Trump was right on that. Now Obama, in his memoir, he wants to take credit for predicting that. No, Mr. Obama. He wasn't the hip, Hyde Park, what we now call woke, I'll call it back then, hip Hyde Park crowd. And he knew what the leftist arguments were, and that's what they were saying. I documented in the book I wrote, Burn That Bridge. He didn't say anything that anybody else wasn't saying on the left at the time. Now he wants to take credit that he predicted that the occupation would be a disaster in Iraq. No, we all predicted that. That was a given. What will happen now? I have no idea. Look, I listened to your program with Chas Freeman. I watched it last night, and I actually watched all 46 minutes. He's obviously an extremely knowledgeable guy, for sure, and he's a serious guy, and he knows the region. He was the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, so he knows the region. And at one point, he says you have to take what Trump says. He says not with a grain of salt, but with a boulder of salt, and yeah, that's obviously wise counsel. The only thing is, as I said to my friend Sana Qasim today, my friend, my comrade, my webmaster, my everything, I said to her, well, these are the same people who were saying that Hamas was defeating Israel in Gaza. So I have to take them with a grain of salt because that was all wrong. That was all wrong. I noticed the Israelis are now saying it's going to take a few weeks in Iran. And that was interesting to me. You know why? Because they never said it would take a few weeks in Gaza. They knew it would take a very long time. You know why? Because Iran is a war. Gaza was a genocide. And they knew to execute the genocide would take time. But they think they can just decapitate. A few more weeks, probably this week will begin the intense terror bombing because usually the conventional, what they call, the expression they use, the target bank. Well, Iran is a very big place, so they must have a very large target bank. The problem, target bank meaning military sites to take out in order to win on the battlefield. The problem is, so that would normally take some time for a place as big as Iran to exhaust the target bank, as it's called. The thing is, Trump doesn't want to wait. He's very impatient. He's on his social media and he's saying this war is getting a bad rap and he wants to win. And so his instinct is no, it's not going to be a few weeks. He wants to go right to the terror bombing. He wants right to go to right there. It's so funny. You read the headlines, the New York Times, it just can't overcome its hack impulses. It refers to Israel targeting Hezbollah in Lebanon. Really? No. Israel's engaged. What is, like everyone calls it, the Daya doctrine? Like it's some brilliant new doctrine, like not since Sun Tzu and what's the oh gosh, the famous military manual in the West, not Sun Tzu.
The Art of War.
Well, that's Sun Tzu, but there's another one in the West. As if they invented a new concept, the Daya doctrine. The Daya doctrine is as old as the hills. It's terror bombing a civilian population to turn it against the reigning power. In the case of South Lebanon, it's the Hezbollah. They're not targeting Hezbollah. They're targeting the civilian population. It's just old-fashioned terror bombing. Just like what they did. Even now, the morons keep speaking of the morons and the propagandists keep speaking of the Israel-Hamas war. There's no war against Hamas. There were no battles. Not even one Israeli was killed per day. Not one. Not even one. It was like one every 2 days, or 1.5. It was just a genocide. No, the genocide wasn't to exterminate the people. That's correct. The genocide was designed to expel the population. But in order to expel it, they realized they had to destroy a significant part of the population because they didn't want to move. Or they didn't want to leave Gaza. And also they couldn't leave Gaza. So they were trying to not just, they resort to genocide, not just to get them to leave, but also to persuade, in quotes, the international community to take them in. As in they're committing a genocide, we should take them in. And there was an argument there. I mean, it was a moral quandary, whether you should be advocating that the borders of Gaza be opened and they can go to Egypt. It was a moral quandary. But it was a genocide. And here it's what I would describe, and it's not unusual. It's a conventional war in order to destroy Iraq's defensive capacities. Forget offensive because it never really had offensive capacities. It's defensive capacities, but it also has a terror component, namely the use of terror bombing in order to turn the population against the government. But it's not a genocide because ultimately the US and Israel want to prevail on the battlefield. They want to defeat it militarily. And so ultimately, it's a conflict between armies. Now, it has a terroristic component, but at the end of the day, it's what Trump said, what the ape said. He wants unconditional surrender. They did not want unconditional surrender in Gaza. Absolutely not. They wanted to keep Hamas, at least in the media imagination, they wanted to keep Hamas alive. They don't want surrender, they want expulsion. Very different. There was no military to speak of. There was no military component to Gaza. It was a annihilation aimed not to militarily defeat Gaza, but it was an annihilation aimed to expel the population by systematically exterminating the population. As I said, I already told you, I won't comment on the military matters. I mean, Chas Friedman was extremely knowledgeable. I've heard many very knowledgeable people speak on the topic, but I'm of the Tolstoy opinion. And Tolstoy said the notion in his great novel, War and Peace, too many unpredictable factors in war to know who's going to win. Too many variables. It's impossible to predict with any. Who would have ever thought the Vietnamese would hold out for 30 years? Who would have ever thought that? I mean, that was terror bombing on a monthly scale. They were dropping by 68, I believe, the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs in Vietnam every month. And they held out. Will Iranian people, the Russian example is an interesting one, the Soviet Union. When the Nazis invaded Russia or the Soviet Union, it was a walkover the first few months. They just took over everything. And part of it, plausibly, I would say, was due to lack of preparation by Stalin. I'm not sure how large a factor was, but the main factor was very obvious. The main factor was Stalin had carried out a very brutal collectivization, and the regime was very unpopular by the 1930s, very unpopular because it was so brutal. So it was a walkover for the Nazis. The problem was the Nazis were waging a war of extermination in the East. In the West, it was a fairly conventional war. Prisoner of war camps, and it was pretty conventional. In the East, it was a war of extermination. They wanted Lebensraum, and Lebensraum meant you had to get rid of living space. You had to get rid of the indigenous population. So between the Nazi goal and Stalin recast the war, he dropped all the communism. It became the Great Patriotic War, recalling the War of 1812, the Great Patriotic War, and they revived the Russian Orthodox Church, and it was the motherland. What will happen in Iran? It's hard to say whether, number one, the brutality of the terror bombing, it reaches such a magnitude that's going to turn the population in support of the regime and against the US and Israel. That's one possibility. And whether the Iranian leadership can successfully cast this as a great patriotic war. And for a large number of the people to forget that it was a pretty miserable place under the uh, regime that's currently in power. Those are all imponderables. I know from Vietnam, I once asked a person pretty high up in what was the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. I asked, how did they do it? I can't understand this. How did they manage to hold out? And his answer was very simple. He said to me, the party was so dedicated, so committed, an iron fist. Those people were real revolutionaries. And that nucleus, it was able to and the organizing, the commitment of their lives, they were able to hold out. What the Iranians, that level of commitment, that capacity, and of course, in the case of Vietnam, they had carried out the communists had carried out major land reform, which had won over large numbers of people to support the regime. As I said, look, I can go on with this for an hour. There's just so many variables that I agree with Tolstoy. Ultimately, there are just too many variables you cannot predict anything. So I grant the knowledge, and I learn, from people. There are many commentators now, but Freeman definitely he has a firm grasp. But as I said, I believe they all got it wrong on Gaza. Number one, so that causes me to wonder. And number two, uh, too many variables to make any firm predictions. Too many variables. I hope they hold out. I'm not afraid to say it.
Just on the Tolstoy vein, Mark Bloch, who was killed during the Second World War, he
Yeah.
wrote great books. Historian, he wrote a book called As Historian's Craft, and in that book, he said that during wars, one thing one doesn't need to trust. He was writing about sources and what historians don't
Uh-oh,
need to
I'm in
trust.
trouble. I'm in trouble. We're at 2 o'clock. I had an appointment. I'm gonna
Okay,
have to cut you short.
we'll leave it there. He just said that don't believe the press on anything, any military matters that's coming out, because it's just propaganda. So it's hard to believe anything in the press on the military front. But the analysis are helpful. Okay, we'll leave it there, Professor Finkelstein. Thank you so much for your time and analysis. Have a wonderful rest of the day ahead. Bye.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.